So far at the G7 foreign ministers meeting, are we seeing more of a united front with regards to Taiwan and China?
Thank you very much, Mandy. This is a great question. And I think what we've seen from the G7 foreign ministers is a united stance on really demanding the Russians withdraw from Ukraine to stop the conflict and to really join the community of the international community of nations that follow international law. And I think that this is an important message within the G7, but I think we can also connect this to how even French analysts believe that the Macron statement on Taiwan and on Ukraine in particular really go against, I think, European interests, French interests, and the interest in preserving a rules-based order.
How do you think China is taking all of this, and what kind of reaction do you think we're going to get?
Well, China will continue to be critical of any multilateral organization that doesn't include China. They see the G7 as a small clique of nations that is anti-China, and that, of course, these nations themselves are Western-based nations that are producing rules that don't reflect the so-called global South, which China identifies with. Here, I think that there's many hypocritical points in terms of China's position. In fact, they've prospered under the rules that have been laid out by the so-called Western countries. They've actively joined so-called Western institutions like the IMF, and they engage in multilateral trade, which is propped up by so-called Western countries. So their position is somewhat problematic when they criticize groups like the G7.
Stephen, in terms of the animus and the tensions between the US and China, and they do look as if they are going to worsen, isn't the G7, because of its very mandate, because it is an informal grouping, an informal forum with non-binding strictures, aren't they more or less powerless to prevent deeper tensions between the US and China?
Well, here I think the G7 has two purposes. One is to, of course, work on macro policy together. It's a non-binding multilateral forum, but to coordinate macro policy to deal with the broader changes within the region and pressures associated with the U.S.-China strategic competition. Two is to push the United States in a more productive direction. And what I mean by that is to start to think about trade, start to think about regulation, start to think about how they can conceive and perceive the Chinese challenge moving forward. Is it only a security threat, or can they create more crosswalks in terms of cooperation to deal with global challenges, whether it's COVID-19, environmental concerns, or dealing with a global economic recovery?